at the federal level and the state level. There's kind of an overlap. You know, as 501c3s, you guys are you guys maintain your tax exemption by not doing too much lobbying, and I'll get into like specifics on that. But then there are also lobby disclosure laws in the states and at the federal government that cover the kind of stuff that it sounds like the Choose Clean Water will be doing, and that maybe its member organizations you guys will be doing in the coalition, which is actual direct legislative lobbying or attempting to influence legislation. The federal government has a lobby disclosure law, and the states have those too. And as you can imagine, you know, the purposes of the two laws, the two tranches of laws, the IRS purpose is to make sure that charities are actually behaving the way Congress has decided public charities should be. And the lobby disclosure laws are the purpose is at least to promote public disclosure of what entities, you know, what kind of communications entities and which entities are trying to influence state and federal and local councils on laws. And then at the very end, we'll talk a little bit about compliance. So moving on to slide 3, just want to jump right into the IRS rules. So as you all know, I'm sure, you know, 501c3s may engage in lobbying activities. So what you can't do is engage in like a whole lot of lobbying activities. If your purpose for being, if an organization that's otherwise tax exempt, if the only reason that it operates or exists, or the main thing it does, is to try to influence legislation or otherwise be like an action organization, what the IRS calls an action organization, it wouldn't be a 501c3. It would have to be a 501c4 or maybe a 501c6. Those are like 501c4s are the social welfare organizations that you hear all the time about. And 501c6 are like trade organizations, typically for businesses. And those types of nonprofits, they're tax exempt, but they can engage in like 100% lobbying. The difference between 501c4s and 6s and a C3, though, is a big difference is that a donor to a C3 gets a tax deduction, and donors to C4s and C6s don't. So actually skipping to like the 4th dash under the top bullet, lobbying, the tests for lobbying, you know, a 501c3, unlike the C4s and C6s, can only engage in like some lobbying, and it's got to be lobbying that helps its overall charitable purpose. It's got to have an overall exempt function to continue as a C3 and maintain not only its tax exempt status, but the ability to give donors a tax deduction for their contributions. And so there are 2 tests for how you stay a C3 rather than like going over that line to becoming a C4 social welfare organization or an action organization, as the IRS calls it, or a C6, which is like a trade association. 2 tests for how you can engage in lobbying as a C3 and stay within your C3 lines and stay tax exempt and not cause any issues with the IRS. And the first test is that no substantial part of your overall activities can be engaged in propaganda, including lobbying. Propaganda is the IRS's old-fashioned 1950s word for lobbying. So you've got no substantial part, and so that has been kind of like in court cases that phrase, no substantial part can be devoted to propaganda or otherwise lobbying. That sort of phrase has been interpreted as anything between like 5% of the overall activities of the organization and 20%. So it's kind of a nebulous test. The other test is the expenditure test, and that's a bright line test, basically, or as bright a line as you can get with IRS rules. Some of you may be electors of this test. This is the 501H election. This allows a charity to maintain its 501c3 status and elect to report its direct lobbying expenditures and its grassroots lobbying expenditures to the IRS. And The only thing is that it's like a sliding scale. The organization, based on like its overall activities and overall gross receipts, it comes up, the IRS comes up with a number up to like $1 million a year that the organization can spend on that is called the non-taxable amount. And I don't want to get into the details of the expenditure test because I don't think that that's really the purpose of this group. That's more for your compliance folks. But this expenditure test, it allows the charity to basically say, yeah, we're going to spend a certain number of dollars on direct lobbying and this certain number of less amount of dollars that we get every year on grassroots. And we're going to substantiate that in case we get examined. And we're going to elect that and disclose it publicly on our 990s, so anybody can see that, how much we're spending. And the IRS is okay with that. So the bottom line, I think, for today, all you really need to know is that any charity can engage in some lobbying. Whether you elect, whether your charity, I don't know if you're running it or if you guys on the line are more the substance folks, but whether or not the charity has elected under this 501H election, which kind of gives the bright line, and you sit down with your accountant and bookkeeper and the tax guy and figure out what the numbers are that you can spend. Or if you're going with the no substantial part test, you're saying, look, we're just doing a small amount of lobbying. We go into Washington one day a year. We send somebody in, this legislation that's pending, this appropriation, we really need to go into lobby day and spend like one day a year going in and another few days preparing for that meeting with the Congress. Anyway, we're going to call this no substantial part because overall it's like less than 5% of our activities. So anyway, that's a long drawn out way of saying that charities can engage in some lobbying, but within limits. So that's the fourth dash there. The top two dashes are the kinds of lobbying that you come up, that typically you're going to be engaging in. And you're going to be doing, it sounds like most of the people here are going to be engaging in direct lobbying. They're actually you're going to have direct communications with officials to influence some pending legislation in Congress. And now the other side is grassroots. And I don't know if many of you do this type of lobbying, but this is where you're asking members of the public or any segment thereof of the public to go out and contact Congress, contact a state legislature, contact Maryland State Assembly or what have you to influence legislation. And this all includes federal, state, and local legislation. So it's all covered, all levels are covered under the IRS tests, and but it's just legislation, and we'll get to that in a few slides. So this bottom bullet here, political campaigns, this is something you can't do anything of. Charities simply cannot intervene in any kind of election or campaign for any kind of elective office. So you can't, do anything like, politicking for your favorite congressman. You can't hold fundraisers. You can't do anything like that. Now, most charities are savvy enough to know that they can't, do like the really blatant kind of engagement in political activities, like holding a fundraiser or endorsing the charity coming out and endorsing the candidate. There are a lot of the problems with the IRS, and it's not a focus of our presentation today, so I'm not going to spend much time on it, just to point out that a lot of times, we're in 2018, we're coming up on a congressional cycle. If you do any kind of ads, that's a lot of times sort of ground zero for whether or not you're maybe engaging actually in election activity. So be very careful of anything like an issue ad that you're trying to run, or any kind of commentary that you're running that's getting closer and closer to an election. The IRS has some good guidance out there for it. You probably have pro bono counsel or in-house counsel maybe who have even, used this guide. It's called Rev Rule 2007-41, and they go through about like 25 situations, or maybe it's just 20, of activities that you might not think of as election type activities that actually the IRS has said, well, you know, you actually are intervening in a candidate campaign. So that's just an aside. What you're talking about doing on lobby day, on sign-in letters right now, on legislation, that's pure lobbying activity that isn't going to raise any political campaign issue. Okay, enough on that. Let's move to slide 4. So this is the rule on direct lobbying. And you know, these rules are basically straight from the IRS regulations on this issue. And I know that, you know, you probably are aware of tax reform, and it's changed some of the landscape for charities regarding excise taxes, and also for donors to charities regarding how many people are likely to itemize, you know, deductions. So that might affect you. But nothing in this tax reform bill has changed the current landscape for 501c3s and the charitable rules. So, you know, these are the rules that this, for a lot of you, for some of you, a lot of you may be review, but it's the same as it was last year. So direct lobbying is any attempt to influence legislation through communication with any member or employee of any kind of legislative body or any government official who can participate in the formulation of legislation. So that's like a big catch-all. That means that you don't necessarily have to be talking to legislators or their staffers to try to influence legislation. You could be having a communication, say, with a governor or another member of the executive branch of the state or the federal government. You know, if you're going in and talking to the EPA or the USDA about specific water issues, for instance, and not just issues, but specific legislation that's actually either pending or proposed. So, you know, so just be careful of that. It's not just when you go in for lobby day, it's not just the congressional members and their staff that are that you're going to be talking to about legislation. If you're talking to any executive branch members and talking to them about legislation and trying to influence them on that legislation, you know, that's going to be picked up in your in lobbying activity under the tax rules. So, you know, the communication has to refer to and reflect a view on legislation. And I'm not going to get a whole lot into this. This is like sort of a term of art. The IRS has a lot of guidance on what this means, but the bottom line really is it means what it says. You've got to be talking about specific legislation, and it can be something that's either pending in Congress or that's proposed or it's going to be proposed. It's some legislation there that you can point to. And you've got to actually have a view on it. You know, you're going in and you're saying to the staffer, this is good, we want you to pass it. We want your boss to pass this. Or this is bad, we want them to change it. Or this is, you know, good, but it needs some tweaks. All of that kind of communication is going to be lobbying. So it's directly with somebody in the government, and it's oral or written. So, you know, it's going to include the sign-on letters. And I've actually seen that. I remember a number of years ago, we were advising a pro bono client similar to probably Choose Clean Water in a different area that had a number of like coalition members, and they were all going in on this big, huge letter of different things that they wanted Congress and the executive branch to act on. And some of this stuff, and we went through the letter, you know, basically item by item, pulling out, okay, yeah, this is lobbying, you're influencing legislation, or it's a specific proposal, and this is not lobbying because all you're talking about is like an executive order or something. Oh, question? Sorry?
Nope, I think we're good.
Oh, okay. Thought I heard somebody had a question. But, okay, so enough on that. So grassroots lobbying. So that's where you're trying to influence, you know, you're trying to affect the opinions of the general public, and you're trying to get them to do something. And like the bullet says, also, you know, you still have the same refer to and reflect a view on specific legislation. And you've got to encourage the recipient of the communication to take some kind of action. And that, moving on to slide 5, that's the famous call to action. Now, it doesn't sound like that's implicated in what you guys are immediately doing, I don't know if that's, excuse me, I don't know if that's something that any of you guys, your organizations do engage in this kind of activity, but it's pretty common. The good news about grassroots is that typically, you know, if it's done on social media, the IRS regs don't really know about Facebook or social media, but believe me, it counts. And, you know, they're talking still about like op-eds and radio broadcasts and things like that and publications, but all that stuff can be combined to be part of, to be grassroots if it contains, you know, the proper elements. Now, a call to action, it has to be one of these 4 enumerated things under the lead bullet on slide 5. So it's got to be either, you know, telling the recipient that they should contact, it's giving the address and the phone number of a government official, providing a petition or tear-off, or that last one is interesting, specifically identifying 1 or more legislators who are going to vote and their position. And the IRS regs actually have an interesting example in the 4911 regs that maybe you've seen, or maybe your tax folks have seen, where it doesn't really include a classic call to action. It just talks about, yeah, we have this position, and here's this legislature who is taking the opposite position, period. The IRS said that's still grassroots. But like I said, the good news is that, you know, typically a lot of this stuff isn't going to really cost that much. So if you're doing the 501H election, you know, it's going to be probably, you know, especially a small organization running some targeted ads on social media, it's probably going to be well within that sliding scale formula, that calculation that your accountant will give you as far as the number that you can spend on grassroots. And by the way, you know, even though I keep referring to the 4911 regs, which relate to this 501H election that I told you about. Remember, we talked about the no substantial part tests or the 501H expenditure test, the 2 tests for how much lobbying a 501c3 can do. Even though a lot of this law has developed under the election, if you're in an organization that doesn't elect under 501H and you're just trying to argue that no substantial part of your activities is engaging in lobbying, you know, basically the rules are the same. So, you know, the IRS is still going to look for, if you've done some grassroots, they're going to look for the same stuff. Does it refer to and reflect a view on legislation? Does it have a call to action? Things like that. So, and if you're doing direct, the same. So the same body of law is going to apply regardless of which test you've selected. The only difference is, and actually it's a fairly significant difference, it can be a significant difference, you know, if you're doing, if you're kind of on the line of doing lobbying, is that the expenditure test is strictly an expenditure test, right? So it's based on what is the organization spending to do this lobbying, whether it's direct or grassroots. So if the organization is like relying on a lot of volunteers, they can do that, they aren't paying, you know, if they don't have to include salary, you know, that's great, you know, that doesn't go into the expenditure test. Whereas the no substantial part test, you do have to take into account the time of volunteers. So that's kind of an interesting little quirk. You know, anything else related to volunteers, yeah, the expenditure test is going to cover that, you know, office expenses, overhead, and of course the costs that you're paying to vendors to come up with the message if you are using a vendor. So moving on this slide 5, patch through calls. That's an example of something that it's like classic grassroots lobbying. You know, you're talking to somebody and you're saying, well, how, you know, you really need to talk to, you know, this legislator, and then you actually put them in touch with it. You know, to me, that's almost the same as providing a tear-off, except you're actually making the connection. So I would refer to patch through calls as really more of a grassroots type of lobbying rather than direct, because there's still people that, you know, the general public. But there's an argument that it could be direct too. So exemptions from lobbying. Here are the big things. The request for technical advice. This has to come from the government. and it has to be in writing. And they have to be going to your organization and saying, you know, we need to understand this law. We need to understand the impact on the waterway or the Chesapeake Bay or what have you. Give us some of your scientific advice on this. So you can provide them information, and it can be, you know, it's got to be in writing. The IRS has a number of rules. It's got to be directed to the governmental body that asked for it. But that is one good way, if you're asked for it, you know, if you're asked for technical advice, that's one good way to get your message to the Congress or a state legislator. Another big example is nonpartisan analysis, study, and research. This is probably much more useful than the request for technical advice, because a request for technical advice obviously has to come from the government body that needs the advice, whereas the nonpartisan analysis, study, and research, that's something that you have come up with that you can just publish, and that as an organization you're putting something out. You're putting something out for general distribution or for members. The IRS, once again, it has a lot of rules. You know, you can actually take a view. It can refer to specific legislation and take a view on legislation. The IRS's only caveat is that it's got to present what they call a sufficiently full and fair exposition of the opposite side that you're taking in order for it to be excused from either preparation for lobbying or an actual lobbying communication itself. So you can prepare one of these nonpartisan analysis, study, and research things, give it directly to Congress, and it won't be treated as a direct lobbying communication. So that's one area that might be of use to you, not really for lobby days or sign-on letters, though. And then there's a limited exemption for certain communication to membership. It's a really hyper-technical exemption, and I don't think we have time to get into it now, especially since, based on what I understand you guys are doing with the sign-on letters and the direct the sign-on letters and the direct communications, it's not relevant for this. So let's move on to slide 6.
Hey, Patty,
okay.
A question that came through, so I just
Sure.
wanted to pause for a moment. So John Barnes asked, do direct lobbying targets include candidates?
I think they do not. I would have to check that. That's like sort of one of those technical rules, but I think in general it's got to be somebody who's in the government when you're actually talking to them. It can't be somebody who's just running for office. I think I even remember looking at this. Yeah, electing, yeah, direct lobbying communication. It's any attempt to influence legislation with a member or employee of a legislative body or any government official or employee other than a member or employee of a legislative body who may participate in the formulation of legislation, but only if the purpose of the communication is to influence legislation. Yeah, so it's got to be currently in the government. So just talking with a candidate, you know, that's yeah, that would be a good way to not have that go into either your substantial part or your 501H expenditure test.
Perfect. Thank you. Anyone else have any questions since we just paused? Since we're about halfway through.
Patty, this is Peter. Just another clarification on that. So that would also apply if somebody runs to be a member of Congress and they get elected. The time between their election and when they get sworn in, when they're a senator designee, that would still not count as lobbying, right? Because they don't have official position.
Yeah, you know, that, I would think that's the case. Now, I do have to have a caveat for that one, you know, that because there might be, for all I know, some kind of IRS guidance out there on that. My understanding has always been that you had to be in the government and, you know, sworn in and all of that stuff, and not just a senator-elect or a congressman-elect. But that said, you know, before I relied on that, if I were you, I would want to just double-check and make sure that there isn't any kind of IRS revenue ruling or an example in one of the 4911 regs that has some sort of gloss on that.
Thank you.
We just had 2 more questions come in from Dan Smith. So the first one, so, you know, that being said, that candidates doesn't really count. Like, how could we host candidate forums, essentially?
Okay, so that's, you're getting into political activity there, and that's that. Excuse me. That's that Rev rule that I mentioned, 2007-41, and I think it even has like 3 examples of candidate forums, and what the IRS is. So that's not lobbying at all, but you know, so it's getting into the political, and the IRS I think has come up with a solution, or at least a way to look at these things if you meet certain requirements, that they aren't political activity and that you aren't intervening in a campaign. I think one of the requirements has to be that, you know, you've got to invite everybody who's running for the position to the forum. And I actually remember looking into this for a 501c3 client of ours, and it was actually a kind of a tricky question. It's very fact dependent. I hate to kind of punt it, but I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I think it would depend on the particular facts, but there are ways in which it can be done, ways in which it definitely can't be done, and that is, like to say, just having one candidate come in. And I think that you'd have to really adhere closely to that Rev rule, the example in that, to reduce your risk. Okay. And while I'm on that, you know, I just want to mention the stakes here. I mean, when I say, yeah, you guys, you're going to lose your 501c3 status if you engage in too much lobbying, that's kind of a simplification. I mean, the IRS looks at lobbying like, if you're doing the no substantial part test, yeah, the remedy is, the official remedy is revocation of status if you just go hog wild on your lobbying. But the fact is, unless it's like super egregious, super hog wild, you know, most likely they're going to hit you with an excise tax. And for political, the stakes are higher because you're not allowed to do like any lobbying. So there's like no wiggle room. You know, they want you to basically go and look at their Rev rule. I mean, you're not allowed to do any political activity. I'm sorry. And there's no wiggle room there. So they want you to go and look at 2007-41, and if you're going to try to kind of be involved in some things, you know, basically stick to those examples that they say are good, or just not doing anything at all. And the official remedy to the government is revocation of exempt status on that too. But once again, I think it's unlikely, you know, especially if you're making a good faith effort to comply, you know, I think it's very unlikely that you're going to have your status revoked, but that's the one that really is the higher stakes, you know, than the lobbying. Lobbying, there's a lot more wiggle room and a lot more room for interpretation, and it's something that the IRS and Congress have agreed 501c3s can do, whereas so far they're in agreement, and the law remains that 501c3s, including churches, can't get involved in political activity. So, so that's just my aside on that question.
And so the last question that Dan had was that, what about candidates who are running for re-election but currently in office? So I'm going to try and answer that by just saying, based on what you said, Patty, that would count as lobbying because they are in office.
Yeah, if you're talking to somebody who's currently in office, you know, and they and to influence legislation that's before them, then yeah, that's going to be lobbying. You know, if you're going in and talking to somebody who's running for re-election about, you know, their campaign or helping them with strategy, obviously that wouldn't be lobbying. That would be getting involved in a political campaign, either as a volunteer or on behalf of the organization, the C3.
Great. All right. Thank you guys so much for all those great questions. All right, so we are on slide 6 now.
Yeah, and these are just some examples of lobbying. You know, it's basically what you've probably heard before, what you've done before, and what you're planning on doing now at the Lobby Day, meeting with the legislatures to discuss legislation. And it's not just to discuss it. Lobbying is going to be, you know, you're referring to the legislation and you have a view on it, you know, and you're trying to influence because you're telling them this is good legislation, this is bad legislation, this legislation should be passed with these changes. That's all going to be covered direct lobbying. Letters to organization members that encourage them to engage in direct or grassroots lobbying. That's going to be that's going to be more of a grassroots lobbying. Signing letters to legislatures that refer to and reflect a view on specific legislation. Once again, that's lobbying, and that was that example that I mentioned where we worked with a big coalition of C3s that were sending an enormous letter on a number of different issues, and we just picked out the pieces. Yes, everything that you've spent on, preparing for the letter for this issue, and it takes the position on this legislation, this particular legislation, this piece is lobbying. Over here, where you're just saying that the president should revoke some executive order, that's not lobbying. And then research and prep for any of the above. That's all going to be going into your, your test for how much the organization is doing on lobbying. So you've got to take into account that research and prep time too. Moving on to slide 7. Here are some examples of things that aren't lobbying. So, you're just talking to legislators about clean water policy in general, and you're not trying to influence any legislation. Now, if they've got legislation before them, if you walk into their office and you know that the big vote is like in a week or the next day or what have you, and this is like a real point person on the legislation, and you just walk into their office and you kind of talk about, clean water policy in general and making sure that you don't refer to that legislation, I think that's still going to be direct lobbying, because it's just going to be too obvious that you're there. The whole purpose of your meeting is to influence this congressman or this staffer on this specific legislation. So you can't really game it that much. You can't get too cute with it. This bullet really represents, just actual like brainstorming before there's even any legislation even that's even thought of, or that before you even have a legislative proposal. This first bullet is really more like kind of like the verbal equivalent of providing technical advice. You're just going in and you're giving your view of the issue. There's no legislation pending. There's nothing before them. That you're good. You're safe. That's not going to be lobbying. This next one, this is what I just referred to a few minutes ago. You're attempting to influence them on executive orders or regulatory actions or awards of public contracts even. I don't know if a lot of C3s are doing that last one, but certainly the executive orders and the regulatory actions are of interest to C3s. And you can do all of that you want, and it's not going to impact your IRS standing one way or the other. It's not going to affect your tax-exempt status. It still has to be in furtherance of your exempt purpose, obviously, but it's not going to count into your lobbying quota. So, and then op-eds that may refer and reflect a view on legislation, but they don't include any of those calls to action. Now, this is a grassroots lobbying, or this is an example of something that comes close to the line of being grassroots, but because it doesn't have a call to action, it's not going to be considered grassroots. So I know that the grassroots is not really of a whole lot of relevance to you guys, but that's just something to keep in mind. And just go back to that earlier slide where I talk about the 4 different ways that you can have a call to action. And one of them is not even actually telling people to do anything, just identifying a legislator. So just be careful of that one if any of you excuse me, engage in grassroots. So moving on to slide 8. Oh, okay. This is, sorry.
Quick question. So I wanted to point out something really quickly based on what you just said. So the coalition does sign-on letters around different issues, some of them being, actual legislation, some of them being proposed policy from, the state level, like Maryland Department of the Environment or DNR. And then, for instance, we just had this offshore drilling letter that we did that was sent to Secretary Zinke about reopening the Atlantic. So that wasn't legislation, but more so, policy, I guess, from Department of the Interior. So I guess based on what you said, would that offshore drilling letter be not considered lobbying?
Yeah, excuse me, sorry about that. Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, you're going to Zinke who, on an executive action that he took, and that he has the power, and I assume that the letter to him was about the executive action that he took, or the regulatory action that he took, executive branch action, and you're asking him to stop it or take it back. Yeah, that's totally not lobbying. So that wouldn't go into your 501H quota, and it wouldn't go into your no substantial part quota. And let me just clarify, that's totally not lobbying for IRS purposes. When I talk about the Lobbying Disclosure Act in a second, that's going to be lobbying. But for IRS tax purposes, for you guys maintaining your tax exemption, that's not lobbying.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, slide 8. This is all grassroots. I'm not going to belabor this slide. You know, it's a pretty decent slide that goes through the kinds of things that can be grassroots and the kinds of things that aren't. You know, if any of you engage in any of this slide is probably useful, but it doesn't sound like it's relevant to what we're talking about now. So let's just move on to slide 9. And this is the LDA. This is what I just mentioned about your letter to Zinke, Lobbying Disclosure Act. So this is the federal lobby law that requires disclosure just for public, you know, sunshine purposes of the communications that organizations and entities and interested parties are having with the government to influence federal government action. And, you know, you guys, I think that we have at least one lobbyist on the line. You know, to trigger lobby registration under the LDA, it's a really high threshold. It's much higher than a number of states are far lower than this. Federal legislation requires you to have to register under the LDA if you have one employee. The organization has to have one employee who spends 20% or more of their compensated time engaging in lobbying activity. So it's not going to include volunteers first off the bat. It's just got to be their compensated time, and it's got to be lobbying activity for federal purposes, and I'll get into that in a minute. The same employee has to have 2 or more lobbying contacts, and on behalf of the organization. So it won't count if you've got somebody who's engaging in over 20% of activity of what they call lobbying activity, which I'll describe, but they've only had one contact on behalf of the organization that they're currently with, they aren't going to have tripped that registration threshold. And then the company, or in your case, the nonprofit, has to have spent more than $13,000 on that lobbying activity over a 3-month period. So it's a pretty high, it's a super high threshold, actually. It's much higher than most states, really, as far as legislative lobbying. So I don't even know if there's anybody on the line who's registered under the LDA or if this is a concern, but I just wanted to highlight this law, since you guys are going in for Congress, and the fact that, you know, it sounds like, at least from this lobby day and the, you know, a fly-in, a lobby day, a once-a-year lobby day, and a sign-on letter, it doesn't sound to me like anybody's going to hit this threshold, but just be aware of it, because I don't know what else you're doing. Register only the entity that employs the lobbyist. So this comes up really more in like groups of affiliated entities. You basically, you know, it's the one, even if you've got if you're like in a group of lobbyists and you're all, if you're a group of companies rather, it's usually more like for-profits. Whoever is like giving the W-2 to the lobbyist is going to be registered as a lobbyist employer. And then this is a termination bullet, when you can terminate. So moving on to the next slide, slide 10. So lobbying activity under the federal law it's either having lobbying contacts or it's research and preparation for those contacts. So that's your own research, or it's strategizing with others, like the Choose Clean Water Coalition, for their lobbying contacts in preparation for your own lobbying contacts. So but it's got to be, it's like a purpose-driven test. It's intent-based. You know, if you're doing something with no intention of actually going in and lobbying, and then you wind up using it later, that kind of prep wouldn't count. You know, you've got to be either having contacts or doing the work in preparation for lobbying contacts. So a lobbying contact, it's communicating with covered what they call covered legislative officials and covered executive branch officials to attempt to influence legislation, contracts, or any other position of the government. So back to Zinke and the drilling. Yeah, you know, he's definitely a covered legislative officials under the federal lobby law are basically Congress and their staff and anybody who works for them. So they're all covered. So that's easy. Covered executive branch officials are a little bit different under the LDA. They're like certain high-level officials. Well, like appointees, typically political appointees. Well, Zinke's obviously a political appointee, so he's a covered official, definitely. And you're trying to influence him on the drilling thing, which is a position of the federal government. That would be considered lobbying under the LDA. Now, this final bullet, for charities that elect to report lobbying expenses under 501H, if you've got that 501H election, you get to use what they call Method B for lobbying, registration, and reporting purposes. And so if you're using Method B, it's essentially, it just says, you know, for purposes of the threshold, for purposes of reporting, you know, just consider your communications with executive branch officials to the extent that they are to influence legislation. So if you're doing Method B, the Zinke thing, talking to Zinke about his drilling deal, wouldn't count. So under the LDA. So that's this kind of, it's sort of this nice little avenue that they've given charities to basically keep one set of books and keep one set of rules to comply both at the federal level and the state level. So that's what you've got with the LDA. I think, you know, I don't know whether it's relevant, but I kind of doubt that most of you are in a position where you'd ever get to that 20% threshold, whether you're just talking about legislation or if you didn't go with Method B. You know, charities don't have to go with Method B. And in fact, charities that are doing the no substantial part test, you know, that haven't done that 501H election, they can't do Method B. So the Zinke thing would be back on the table there, but it still seems like a 20% threshold is awfully high. So moving on to slide 11, this is just a little thing that I noticed you had in your presentation last year, just some comments about local lobby laws and state level lobby laws. And so, you know, I don't know what else you guys are doing that isn't the lobby day or isn't the federal stuff, but, you know, all states do cover legislative lobbying. Every single state does, and DC. And most of them also cover regulatory. So, you know, it's got to be, it's like if you're in Maryland, you're trying to influence Maryland legislation with the Chesapeake Bay or Maryland regulatory actions. You know, those would be covered. Maryland has a threshold for lobby registration. I don't know offhand what it is. It's lower than the 20% thing, but I think it still does have a threshold. You know, there are some places like Chicago that don't have any threshold, that basically say, yeah, if you're coming in to lobby us, you have to register. You have to register before you lobby us, or you have to register within like 5 days or something. So just be aware of those different states and local laws. You know, I think Alliance for Justice is a 501c3 that like provides all this compliance information to other 501c3s, and you could just go to their website. They've got some really great plain language write-ups. I mean, I use them too. So, and that are kept, you know, they update them when they can based on staff. So that's where direct lobbying is covered. This last paragraph, yeah, there's most states or a lot of states do cover grassroots to some extent. Some of it actually triggers registration as a lobbyist. Other times you just have to report it if you're already registered. So moving on to slide 12, compliance strategies. You know, I don't know how much volume you have. You know, a lot of our clients here at Skadden are for-profit businesses, and they might be, you know, really more procurement lobbyists. So, you know, this is probably more relevant to them. I mean, as far as the volume, I'm not sure how many requests you're going to have as an organization for lobbying, you know, whether or not somebody can lobby. You know, I think you could do pre-clearance, basically. You should probably, if somebody wants to go and have direct communications with a legislator or a government official, state or local level, most of you are probably small enough that, at least if you're not getting pre-clearance, at least people know about that in the organization, and to see whether or not you've got a compliance trigger. So you've got to remember, you're keeping tabs of lobbying, not just for your IRS purposes, but also in case there is some sort of state or local or federal registration lobby disclosure rule that you're up against. And just, I think the biggest thing, if for a threshold that requires a certain amount of like expenditure on compensation or expenditures on lobbying, that this second dash, maintenance, time tracking, that's probably your biggest challenge. Under the Lobby Disclosure Act at the federal level, they just have a good faith estimate of seeing if you hit that 20% threshold. It doesn't have to be scientific or exact. They're just looking for good faith. So, you're keeping like our calendar that shows what you did. You might have like a rough timesheet that you have to supply every week. Calendars that show meetings, either internal ones to prepare for lobbying or meetings with government officials. That would be certainly sufficient, under the LDA. And I think for most state and local laws, that sort of thing would be sufficient too. So, I wouldn't get crazy with the time tracking, but if you know that you've got somebody you've either got a lobbyist or you've got somebody who's going to be having contacts and you check the threshold and you see it's like, say in New York State, it's like a $5,000 threshold of compensation for lobbying. That you have to spend that the organization would have to spend in order to trigger registration, and you look at that compensation as an in-house employee's or a retained lobbyist's time spent lobbying or preparing to lobby. So it's kind of like a pro rata thing if you have an in-house person. So those are just some, I just want to put it on your radar, that you've got these disclosure laws out there. You've got the IRS thing. So you've kind of got like a dual track of lobbying compliance that you have, that 501c3s have, that for-profits typically don't have. So, it's a little bit tricky, but I think your highest priority, it sounds to me, is definitely the IRS issue. So I guess with that, I'll just say, are there any questions?
Thanks so much, Patty. And I think this was a great overview and, a lot of great information on the rules. And I think, for most of the folks that I'm seeing, at least that are signed in today, with the exception of our lobbyist, Peter Marks, I think for the most part, a lot of these folks on the phone, their one shot at doing anything related to lobbying is really, at least for in person, is when they come to our Hill Day. And then, some of the sign-on letters that are about legislation, so I would say probably, I don't know, maybe it's half and half of our sign-on letters are legislation versus not being legislation, more policy or something like that. And so I guess from what I'm taking away from your presentation is, if that's really the only time that you guys, that our members are participating in anything like this, no one should be overly concerned that they're going to have their 501c3 revoked because they come to Hill Day, I guess.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yes. I totally agree with that.
Okay. Or sign on to one of our sign-on letters. So.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah, because you guys are doing all the work. They're just signing on. I mean, yeah. So it's like a negligible amount of even if you have a 501h expenditure, that would be very negligible. If you're just the time that you're taking to read the letter and sign on and put the organization's name down as a supporter of the letter.
Okay. Great. So does anyone have any questions? They want to either use the chat box or you feel free to use the phone as well. Guess we covered it all.
Well, I left my phone and my email. If there are any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Patty, for joining us today. This was really, really helpful. I think I learned a lot too, and I think I will be able to better communicate about what we're doing over here at the coalition as well. So thank you again.
Great.
For folks on the phone, just remember this is recorded, so I will pass it around to folks after this call, along with the current letters that we have out for sign-on. And based on Patty's presentation, they are both lobbying. Because one is related to appropriations, so the funding for the Chesapeake Bay, and the other one is related to the environmental justice bill that Senator Cory Booker has submitted. So both of those are out for sign-on, and then also for our registration for our lobby day is now open, and the deadline to register to come is next Friday, March 9th. So I will send all of this information around to everybody after this call. Feel free to forward to folks in your office that could not join us. And I just want to thank Patty again for this great presentation and all this awesome information.
Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Patty.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.